welcome to the 19th episode of the IDRiM podcast. Today's podcast is very much a continuation of last week's podcast, and this week, myself and Harris are going to be particularly looking at social media, misinformation, and the relationship between the two. And then also, I'm going to talk about how actually just one person, it could be you, who can truly change the narrative and the story of climate change and actually help us combat climate change. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Now, what the interesting things that I found from your explanations just now is that there are two groups that actually have big skepticism with the climate change, especially the impacts, as you mentioned, the sea level rise, the extreme weathers, and it's connect to with your previous explanation about the misinformations. Perhaps I'm not sure this is like I'm grasping here that the 65 years olders, it's like they are encountered with misinformations, but doesn't have any capabilities to you know to defense from them. That's why like maybe perhaps they already swayed based by the misinformation. But and it's this kind of people usually in this age group, very difficult to, if they already believe firmly, they will not can be shifted by their surroundings, although perhaps what they believe is from misinformations, right? And perhaps the young generation, you also mentions that they are this is the group that actually got a lot of misinformations, although more resilience towards that. In accordance on what you explained before about the experience of people throughout their age and the education system that already imbued to the young people, how these misinformations actually also affect their perceptions toward climate change, whether this become another clashing factors with the other evidence that you found before, or it's actually become the catalyst for them to not believing the climate change.
So my belief is very, very clear that with older people, there are very much a generation that have not been brought around from misinformation. So because you were exposed to newspapers, you're exposed to TV news, radio news, and there's an editorial background to these these news stories. Therefore, they go through the process, and they are in the most part there is some truth to it, and there's a very much a they can be backed up, and if they're not, they get into trouble. But when you get companies like Twitter that are not have that same process, for older people it's a bit harder because they're not used to that sort of what I would call rubbish being pumped out every day by bots. And that means that they are going to they're more likely to believe what is being said, especially if they haven't got a firm opinion on an issue. If you haven't got a firm opinion and you're reading this story and you think it's true, you're going to start moving your opinion. And what happens is that once you start reading one opinion, you read someone else with a very similar opinion, then see another one, then see another one, and you get into this echo chamber. And once you get into it, it's very hard to get back out of it. And that's what I think for older people, it's a problem. Now, with younger people, you could be a little bit more of an interesting one because, again, they are being brought up with social media. The first, now probably more second generation that are being brought up with social media. Now, social media, when it was our day, I would like to say, because we're both, I think we're both Gen millennials, aren't we? think we're both millennials. So in our, social media was very much it was very new when it first came out, and we had stuff like, Facebook, Bebo, and it was very much about and it was about your friends, and you only interacted with your friend group. So that meant that we weren't exposed to a lot of information news, outside of our group. So that meant that misinformation really didn't really bubble. It's really, and it's a shame, it's the generation after the millennials that are, the first generation that are going to get a lot of this misinformation. And it's going to be interesting to see as we get into Gen Z and Gen Alpha, how they interact with misinformation, because they're now being brought up with it. Now, are schools and education doing enough, to combat this? I don't know. I generally don't think we are. I think that, and this is going back to my, critical thinking. Remember I said to you about teaching them to push back? This is what I'm trying to say, is that it's getting them skills ready to push back later on. I don't think we're doing that. In fact, I know we're not doing that in the UK perspective. And I think that in my biggest concern now is the sheer amount of misinformation on TikTok about climate change, and we see it not just about climate change, we see it about a lot of other stuff. So in one of the previous podcasts I talked about, we were talking about gender in disasters, and we talked about the increase of misogyny. And my belief is that a lot of this, like, misbelief, and a lot of this information, wrong information is coming out of TikTok as well. And I think that, and that's where a lot of young people are today. That's their social media platform, and I think that that's brewing a lot of misinformation and a lot of skepticism. And I see it. I see skepticism. I see misbeliefs. In the schools, and they say, "Oh, I've seen it on TikTok." It's like, well, TikTok's not really a reliable place for information, and this is the issue we're having to now contend with. Is that the next generation? I will say, or almost like the older generation when it comes to misinformation. Are they able to discern what is true and what is not true? And I think that what we find with younger people is that they will tendency to parrot and believe what they read and what they see. A bit like the older generation, because they, didn't have to push against what is and is not true all the time. And that's my biggest concern, is that if there's so much misinformation and younger people then don't know what is real and what isn't real, it gets to the point where they'll be more skeptical. And this is, I think, the thing we're going to have to watch out for in the next 2 to 5 years in research data. Is there going to be a sudden increase in skepticism of climate change in the younger generation? Because I have an opinion. Is that I think there will be an increase. I think that the misinformation from TikTok is becoming so great now that it is going to be an issue. And I think that we need we need to start finding ways to combat that. Now, is that a ban of social media for certain age groups? Some countries are looking at that for other reasons, but that could be one of them. Is it treating social media companies as publishers? That would mean that they would have to fact check everything that is said. Is that logical? Is that can we do that? Possible. I mean, the argument would be then if people keep pumping out misinformation, they'd be stopped from doing it because the companies would literally be liable for that misinformation. And it's a really, I think governments are going to have a hard job of contending with this, because I think this is not just an issue that affects climate change. It's going to affect all topics of society. And I think that climate change, in some respects, is the canary in the coal mine approach. Is that if there's because I think that there are groups out there who will want to stop climate change in its tracks in terms of action for obvious reasons. And at this stage, I will not list them ones because I do not want to be hit with a lawsuit. But I genuinely believe that we are facing I almost would say crisis level of belief amongst young people if we do not start fixing the misinformation issue amongst and on certain platforms like TikTok.
Yeah. Well, I agree most of the part of it, as we live in the post-truth era, where it's basically the truth is actually come letters, or even the truth is actually not coming at all. But as you mentioned now, that's basically moderations is particularly needed. But it's very difficult in this interconnected age, as all the content is actually generated by everyone, right? Not that particularly in publishers. And now, well, one of my beliefs actually that everyone should have access to anything, and there are some fear of as well that the moderations actually can also shape the people, as as a, for like, let's say, like, you treat it as the social media as a way of the publishing, and then there will be moderations, right? And like, okay, this kind of contents should be following the fact checks, but also, like, there are some entity, for example, tyrant government can actually fabricate evidence into that's why, like, moderation is some kind bad or not bad. But I think uh, what we need, this is just like what I'm thinking, is that first, that every data that's circulating in the internet, including informations or news, should be equipped with the origin. I mean, what it's coming from, that's actually attached to the metadata of the data itself, so they can trace. Especially, it's become relevant now, where a lot of AI generated contents, right? In order to distinguish whether this is evidence come from the observations or it's actually generated from AI. Having the unaltered metadata about how the data is originated is very important, and it's actually also one of the mechanism to fight the misinformations. If we can look at, oh, this originated from this, and we can trace back traceability. The traceability of the informations is necessary. So it's not doesn't necessarily to have moderations, but establishing a network of the traceability of the data who we come to us, so the people have the capacity to actually check whether it's good or not is important. And the second one is basically, as you mentioned now, how to push back. But in my words, I perhaps like the young people should have been equipped with the second thought. Is this correct? Is this the way the world works? But that's very difficult because, like, the young people is actually coming from the early educations, the preschools, and the elementary schools, the primary schools. It's basically, the education doesn't introduce critical thinkings and second thought to the people that age, right? That actually, this is the worldview, and this is the emphasis that you learn first. And that's very difficult because at that age they're also already exposed to misinformation. Now, in terms of climate change, as you mentioned also, there are some groups that actually, you also mentioned your research, basically leading the activism to advocate for climate, the adaptation for the climate change. They're doing the school strike, right? And it's basically coming from the country that I'm living now. The Great Northumbria that's actually coming, she did very amazing job actually at bringing the kids and young people to go. Do you think this kind of activisms actually can also help the young people realize the climate change, or shifting the perceptions, or there should be another method that maybe we don't aware yet that can help them to shape their perception of climate change, to look for more evidence and understand that, okay, this is the world that we live in now?
Yes, and the answer is it does help.
Mm.
So the story, I'll tell you a story here about my PhD research. So if anyone has actually seen the time I started to the time I actually passed, I started my PhD on the 1st of February 2016, and I passed my PhD on the 2nd of February 2021. Now, obviously, there was a pandemic in the middle of that, and obviously submitted in November of 2020. But that's still more than 4 years. And one of the reasons why it was more than 4 years is that when we got to 2019, I was getting to the stage of just writing up, so that I would be ready. I'll be ready around mid July, around July, August. I'll be ready to be in just a little over 3 years, which is about a normal time frame. And then Greta Thunberg came up, and literally all my data started to go pear-shaped because my PhD basically said that, yeah, young people are concerned, but they don't want to talk about it. They're not really active in this. They're literally concerned but not active, as I would just put it, as simple as that. But then Greta Thunberg basically changed it, and one of the reasons why is that it became cool to talk about climate change. It's about, especially with younger people, it's about how do you engage. And when you're talking about something very scientific like that, young people don't want to talk about something very sciencey. They want to talk about, what is Taylor Swift wearing next week, or what was she wearing last night, or or I was gonna say something else there, but would show my age. I won't. But basically, they want to talk about celebrities or gossip, or they want to talk about sport. They don't want to sit down and talk for half an hour talking about climate change. So, and that's the problem. As we get older, we do talk about politics, we do talk about climate change because it's something that we gradually become into as we get older. But when you're 14, 15, and 16, you're not going to talk about it. Let's be honest. But Greta Thunberg did it, and that actually did raise a lot of awareness. And it wasn't just in young people, it was actually across all generations. Because then the older generation started thinking, maybe the young people are actually right here, and it brought attention. And actually, the way that young people did it was a much more effective way than, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, which just basically angered people all the time. And that's not the best, I would say is not the best approach. There are some who would just, look down at their noses at young people saying, you should be at school and that type of approach. There were some who were on the march but didn't know what they were marching about, and that is evident as well. To be fair and balanced on this one. So we got the two ends of the spectrum. My research did show that actually some teachers did use these school strikes actually for good, as well. So I know of one school in Scotland. The teacher actually set them a task: write a newspaper column based upon your experiences at the protest. So they went to the protest. They were doing it for their English language. At the same time, they were learning more about climate change and they were discussing about it. So, and it's about how they use the protest experience to integrate into learning. And it's one of the things that we don't do. We treat climate change as another subject. We put it as a standalone. But what the protest actually started to do was actually make teachers think, oh, we could put it here. We could put it in this subject here. We could integrate it with this. And actually, that maybe is what we need to do more. We need to integrate it more into, subject content that actually, we wouldn't naturally think of putting it in. So basically, write a newspaper column of a protest. You mentioned about the protest. Write a newspaper column of it. Maybe that should be put into the curriculum because that is a way of learning about the subject, but you learn it in a way where you actually refine your English skills that you'll need as you get into secondary school, if you're primary, but also as you're getting older to write in your final exams, leaving school. So I think the protest definitely worked. I think that for that generation who were 14, 15, 16, 17 in 2019, I think they are probably going to have the best, they're going to have the most belief because they will have spent years talking about it. They will spend them years talking about it, and actually probably meant that they were more critical, thinking about it, rather than what we've had since post-COVID has gone back to pre-2019 style of learning and approaching subject matter, which not that useful when you're trying to learn something that is always evolving. And I think that what we need now is to have a more proactive approach when we're learning it. And I don't know if you've seen when I shared you all my files about what I was doing last night, Harris. I don't know if you've seen that workbook as well that I created for a charity that increases education of climate change.
I mean, that's nice though. Yeah, I should look into more of it. But now you actually advocate many good things during our talks now, right? Also, very clearly show the problems where it lies. Now, I'm not sure whether there are, decision makers or the authority that listen to our podcast, but if you can, you know, give something to them, and let's say they are willing to listen to you and change the way it is right now, what will you give them?
The education structure. It's the most simplest one. The education structure is not prepared for it. As I mentioned, I learnt more at school than the current students do on climate change. The science is more sure of it. The information is already changed, and they just don't do it. So, give an example. In the UK, you'll learn this. You'll learn about the greenhouse effect. You'll learn carbon dioxide, methane. You might learn about water vapor. What else? What else do we need there? Impacts. How does it impact us? How you want to learn how much is it warmed? The discernation between natural versus human. What are governments doing? How can we fix the issue? None of that is on the curriculum. What is taught is more basic. So as a part of a scheme that I actually work with outside of Northumbria, I work for a charity called the Brilliant Club. And one of the things that we do is we prepare students for university. And we get to pick a topic, and working with them now for about 4 or 5 years. And what I've done is I've developed a workbook, on climate change. And actually, the students tend to say that in the 5 hours I teach them about climate change, they learn more than they have done in the last 3 or 4 years on climate change. You know what I mean? You think about how much of a big issue it is. And some of the way that we do it is that we don't just talk about the sciences. We actually talk about the way that the foundation of the agreements are and what the problems are with them, and make them understand that this is not a black or white issue, on solutions. The solutions are not black and white. So one of the ideas that I teach them is that I ask them a very simple question, which form of propulsion in cars, which type of fuel is the best? Is it petrol, diesel, hybrid, hydrogen, biofuels? And they'll all have an idea. And I say, well, first of all, you've all got a different idea. That shows that, it has to be a very perceptual based idea. And then I say, well, why is it perceptual? Because, and then I say, okay, what's the problems with each one? And then by the end of it, they're like, oh, there is no perfect solution. And that's what I think. But the issue is that everyone thinks there's this magic bullet, perfect solution. I think for them is to understand quite early on, it isn't. It's about compromises, trade-offs, a lot of this. And I think that's some of it. And actually, I think with climate change, we have a tendency to do this more. Say that, like wind is the best, is the best form of energy. We need to build as many wind farms. Yes, but what's the problem with that? And we don't talk about the problems. And that's the problem with this, is that then if you don't talk about the problems, the skeptics just come along and hit you with it and say, well, it's periodic. So what do you do with the periodicity of, wind? And what you find is that the ones who have a belief in it, but they haven't thought about it all the way through, it starts floundering. And I think that's what we need to start, being more open on the issues. And I think that has to be done at a younger age to get them to understand. So critical thinking, we talked about. We don't do it a lot in Schoon. Schoon, I would say, in the UK is, teaching us what we need to know for an exam rather than how to think. For university, that's one of the reasons why I'm going into the Schoons to, do this. And the other one is I actually look at, language as well of how things are worded. So I would say to them, so there are two examples I like to use. I like to talk about, what does liability mean? When we talk about, so let's talk about the Rio Declaration on Development Environment. And one of the articles says about, the liability and compensation for victims of pollution, and, environmental degradation, inside and outside the barrier. And I actually say, well, okay, if you're flying from country A to country B, and you're flying, whose emissions, who takes responsibility for them emissions? So, give me an example, Harris. I visited you back in March 2023, and I flew via Dubai from the UK to Japan. Do you know what the answer would be for who was responsible for the emissions?
The air flight company, you yourself?
Nah, it's no one, because who's going to agree to it? Who would agree to take them emissions? I mean, you can't, because the way that we calculate emissions is it's within borders, isn't it? Now, how are you going to calculate flying over 25 countries at different speeds and different propulsion levels, different wind conditions? You can't do it. It's impossible, especially when you've got 10,000 planes in the air at the same time. So, and I start getting them to understand that actually, this agreement, when we talk about, this framework talks about liability, what does that even mean? And get them to understand that actually these broad terms, that's where we put law into place, sometimes isn't great. And they think, because what they'll do is I always say, does this law look good? And they say, yeah, and they'll explain why. And I say, well, what about this word? What does that mean? What does that mean? Get to the point where even individual words they have to think about. We don't teach that at school. And when it comes to things like climate change, critical thinking is key. And it's key for all subjects to fight misinformation, but for climate change, it is key because it gets them to think about, because as I said, there's no perfect solution in this. And if you have to start thinking about, the trade-offs and being critical on that, that is the foundation to have an educated, discussion on what is needed to be done. And we don't do it. And it frustrates me that we don't do it.
Yeah, I mean, your examples are your case study. It's like it's vividly made me thinking. Yeah, how about the emissions, all those things. Especially like you mentioned also, like every country has their own political intention as well. So it's very difficult to them together as the emission and all those things. So I think much better educations. I agree with you. Better collaborations perhaps in order to tackle this, and or perhaps or maybe just maybe the entire world look at or view it in the wrong way, right? Maybe like it's already coming along and it's the emissions already at this, and like instead of trying to put punish for the past that we did, perhaps like how we can actually collaboratively, hand by hand, working together toward the better futures, right? Now you already give your case, right? And especially for our listener here, and let's say many of our society members is actually scientists and all the people that are already dealing with these issues in their research, right? And however, there are also some groups in our society that perhaps will benefit a lot of this. So, of someone, a young person, as we have a YSS, young scientist, listening to this and let's say feeling overwhelmed or excited, or like, oh, this is good, this is great, what advice would you give, Mark, to them about getting involved in the reducing or adapting the climate change?
I think the advice I would say is start small. I think we have this tendency to think that I'm one person, I can't, do everything. Of course, that's right. And I think that's the issue that we have, is that we have this individualistic belief system, the I call the me belief, and saying, well, I can't fix it. I mean, I see this all the time. I see it online, I see it in person, when I'm in schools. Why should I, if you come from a skeptical point of view, why should I reduce my emissions when, China have building all these coal plants and they're doing all this, that, and the other? And I say, well, first of all, where's your top being made? Where's your table being made? Where's everything you're using being made? It's all made in China. So actually, it's all your responsibility as well. And that's because they view climate change as a big thing. Now, if you view it from, what can I do? It's the same problem. It's like, I'm one person, I can't fix everything. And of course you can't. But if that one person, then there's another person, then another person, you slowly come in as a group and you can make some big changes even as a small group. In the UK, well, let's talk about Greta Thunberg. But how did she start? One single, 15-year-old girl sits outside of school, refusing to go to school. Next week, someone joined her. Then and then literally we get to the point where we have protests in over 100 countries in a space of a couple of months. It only started by one person. So don't actually underestimate what your one individual action can do. And to give you a sense, that the school strikes started Extinction Rebellion, didn't it? What did they do in the UK? Because of what the government under Theresa May listened. She moved the target of the 2008 Climate Change Act, which made that the UK had to reduce its emissions by law from 80% by 2050 to net zero. We jumped an extra 20% because of the public push. And inarguably, that'll start by one girl in Sweden, change UK law. So my basically belief is that don't think that your one individual action means nothing, because there are other people who will feel the same way, who will want to do something but won't know how to do it, will see you do it and will follow you. And as a group, you actually have a lot more power than you think.
What a great advice. So I think that's it for today's. We will talk a lot on youth, climate perceptions, even misinformations, and what can we do for the better futures. So thank you, Mark, for today's sharing your entire research and with us, and for everyone who listened to this episode and you enjoy this episode, please keep listening to us, and hopefully some of you or many of you can start taking actions for adapting to climate change. And see you next time.
Bye.